Education, something that we as lawyers care a lot about. We want to continue to get better at what we do, so we come into this room to receive education. And I'm really glad that our friends at the Parr were able to make this space available for us today, because you all wouldn't fit in our conference room in my law firm. I want to just talk about Pat Jones briefly. She's a hero of mine. She's a mentor to me. I know she really wishes she could be here. She's picking Utah State University's new president. That's why she's not here today, which is really cool. I've been on the board, like Nicole mentioned, for about 5 years, and that's been a real honor and privilege to be involved with the Women's Leadership Institute. I've done a lot on the leadership side in legal circles, and I've been a lawyer for a long time. I know, looking at me, you probably all think I just graduated from law school, but actually that was in 1991. It was a long time ago, and things have changed in the legal community in big ways. I just wanted to mention that briefly. First of all, let me put it this way. When I first started practicing, and I would go to a deposition, which is an interview under oath, it's before trial, or I would go to a meeting of leaders of one of the committees, and there would be a woman in the room, it would be a lot like I feel right now. You know, you've got one person in the room today that's male, which I love. Back then, it was a lot like that for my friends that were women lawyers. That it was that way in law school to some extent. Today, in law schools, in most places around the country, including in Utah, women make up the majority of law students, which is incredible. And we are also seeing that now push through into law firm leaders in the community, and certainly with the Supreme Court, as we'll talk about in just a minute. I think that's a wonderful trend. We still have a ways to go. I love the story that, who told that first story this morning that came up?
Over here.
Over here. That was just so beautifully said, because it embodies how Pat likes to do things with the Women's Leadership Institute. And that, if you look at the board, her board, we have men and women on the board, and that is very intentional on Pat's part. Because I'm going to use some A words here. The first one, you can look at, if you're a women's group, you can look at men as adversaries. Say they're the enemy. They're causing these problems. And it's true. A lot of men behave badly. It's a fact. But if you treat all men as adversaries, and that never changes, then that makes it harder for all of us together to see that rising tide that will lift all of our boats. And instead, the A word that Pat uses for men is allies. She is looking for allies, or to use Sarah's word, helpers. And I think what ends up happening, and I think the story really embodied that, is that if you look at men as allies to help women be treated better and more equally and to be successful, and as potential mentors and helpers in that network, then what you do is you turn, potentially, not all the time, but you can turn men who are adversaries into my last A word, which is advocates. And I feel so strongly about the issues that confront our society with respect to pay inequity, so many other things. I advocate for that in a lot of ways. And groups that I'm involved with, Salt Lake Chamber, for example, has looked at that pay gap as one of its primary initiatives. And I'm the co-chair of policy for the Chamber, along with Amanda Covington, who works at the Larry H. Miller Group, and is absolutely incredible. So I love Pat's approach. How many lawyers do we have in the room? I know we got some judges, and we got a couple. If it would be okay, I just want to explain very briefly about the legal structure, because this is the legal day for the Career Development Series. Some things that you would think I would know about, I don't think I figured out till after I graduated from law school. Okay, so as far as the legal system goes, there are two court systems. There's the federal court system, and there's the state court system. And the federal system, the United States Supreme Court is at the top of the federal system. You have courts of appeals around the country that are regional. For example, Utah is in the 10th Circuit, and that's Intermountain states. You also have Oklahoma and New Mexico, and that is the federal system. So you have a trial court here in Utah. We have amazing trial judges, federal trial judges here. If you lose and you want to appeal, you go to that regional court, and then it goes to the United States, so the United States Supreme Court. That's the federal system. They're a court of limited jurisdiction. They'll talk about federal issues, for example, employment, that many of you may be working in the employment space. A lot of those cases go to federal court. The state court system, and the way it works in the state court system, we've got a lot of different courts of specific jurisdiction. Like we have commissioners here in this county that handle divorce cases. You have district court judges similar to the federal judges. And then you have a court of appeals for all of those district judges. And then you have a Utah Supreme Court that has 5 people on it. And one of the things, if you look at trends in our legal community for both the federal system and the state system here in Utah, is that we're seeing more and more women assume those positions of authority. And that is so important. It is particularly important to women, and we also are working very hard so that people of color, when they walk into a courtroom, or women, when you walk into a courtroom, again, coming back to what I said before, you want that to be a great experience, because we have to have confidence in our courts. If people walk into our courtrooms and nobody looks like they look and they're there for justice, that's wrong. If you have women going into the courtroom, they're a party, they've been sued, or they're suing someone else, and they're the only one in the courtroom that looks like them, we're not going to have confidence and trust in our judicial system, which is so key. And that is why I'm so excited to be able to moderate a panel with the highest court in Utah. The Utah Supreme Court has 5 members, and 3 of them are women. And so I'm going to invite them up. Justice Hagen, Justice Pullman, Justice Peterson, if you wouldn't mind coming up and taking seats up here, please give them a round of applause. So for the first time in Utah's history, last year, with the confirmation of Justice Pullman, we had a majority of women on the Supreme Court. And that comes back to that trust. I mean, it's just awesome. Not very many states are like this, and it's a wonderful thing. So, all right, thank you. That was great. I'm thanking you on behalf of the state of Utah. So, what I thought would be interesting, and I hope it will be, I can promise you, you're going to be inspired today. I can promise you that. You will learn and you will be inspired today, because I am inspired whenever I interact with any of these 3 justices. What I'm going to do is just tell you a few general things about them, but then I'm going to have them introduce themselves to you by telling you their career story. We are here as part of the Career Development Series for WLI. You're going to hear some amazing stories about career paths. They will say, Career Development Series, this was mine, and this is how I got to where I am. Utah's judiciary is one of the most respected in the country. And one reason why is that we don't have elections. Some judges have elected, some states have elected judges. Think about what that means for trust in the system. So you walk into a courtroom, and this has happened to friends of mine, you'll have a judge look at both sides, and one side has contributed to that judge's election campaign and the other one hasn't. And the ones that donated, the judge is going to be calling them by their first names. That's awkward. You got no trust. Here, it is hard to become a judge. There's a merit-based panel, and that panel looks at all of the applicants. Unfortunately, so many people want to be involved in public service, and they very carefully screen that group and then send a group of finalists to the governor. And the governor then selects from that list, and I know a lot of really amazing lawyers that really wanted to be judges, and it didn't happen for them because there were people like these 3. So they are amazing judges. Every one of them was a judge in one of these other courts that I just described, whether it's a trial court or an appellate court in the case of Justice Hagen and Justice Pullman. So they have great experience as judges. Before that, they were lawyers like I am in some ways. They had different practices. Justice Pullman and I had similar practices. And so we'll hear a little bit more about that. But what they are all highly regarded, they are highly respected, they are gifted as writers and as speakers. But the reason that they are role models to not just the lawyers in our community, but our entire community, is because of how they act. They are role models. If any of you want a great role model or a mentor, consider these three justices because of their bearing, because of their intelligence, because of their work ethic, because of their civility and professionalism, which is part of the culture in Utah. And their community service. I've got to know all three of them really over the years. I think I've known a couple of you for 25 years. Sorry, Justice Hagen. Dates are a little bit. I've worked on boards with all of them, including on the Euclid board with Justice Peterson, which is the Utah Center for Legal Inclusion, which includes some of the issues that I mentioned earlier, particularly about having just judges, women judges, and people of color. And they just care about their communities. So I want to applaud them one more time, and then we'll get started. Okay, Justice Peterson. So why don't you tell the wonderful people in this room about your career story, where you started, where you grew up, and how you got to where you are today.
Okay, hi everyone. So I am a Utahn. I grew up in Castledale and Price. I don't know if anyone knows those parts of Utah. I grew up down there and then came up to, after 1 year of college in Price, I went to the College of Eastern Utah, which is now part of Utah State. But I did 1 year there, and then I came up to the University of Utah, which felt like a big jump for me because Price and Castledale are very small and very rural. So Salt Lake was the big city, and I sometimes joke, as each different place I've gone, I kind of look around and realize I feel a little bit like a fish out of water. I was a child of the 80s. I was going to high school in the 80s, so when I came to Salt Lake, I had really big hair, and I was rocking some 80s hair. And so when I got up here, I looked around and thought, okay, I'm in the big city now. I've got to tone this down a little bit. So I went to college at the U, and then I ended up getting into Yale Law School after the U. And talk about a big leap. So going to the East Coast was a bit of culture shock. And in the beginning, I remember my first semester at Yale, I kept getting my feelings hurt because socially, it's just a little different on the East Coast. People are a little more curt. They're not like we are in Utah. So I kept thinking, everyone is just rude here. No one likes me. And I had a bit of culture shock. But as I got to know people, it was a great learning experience, an expanding experience for me, because I realized, no, it's just different culturally. There are a lot more people here. They're packed in a lot closer. And so people have kind of boundaries that they've set. But beyond those boundaries, they're just like the people I know in Utah. They're just as nice. They're exactly the same. We're all people. And some of my closest friends that I have to this day are people I became friends with in law school. And it was amazing to meet these different people. So, here I am coming from, I've graduated from Carbon High School. I'm a Carbon High Dino. I'm going to law school with people who went to these private boarding schools on the East Coast. And they all knew each other, not just from college and Ivy League colleges, but from their boarding schools in high school. And some of those people became some of my best friends. So it was just wonderful for me to meet people from all these different backgrounds from me. And I had the benefit, people thought I was so nice because I'm just from Utah. So I'm just acting like anyone in Utah does, but they all thought, boy, she's so nice. So I got a big benefit out of that. After that, I clerked for a judge. And then my first job was in New York. And I went there terrified because I literally moved to New York in October 2001, the month after the World Trade Center was hit by planes. And so when I moved there, the ash was flying around in the sky. Still, from burning ash was just blowing around in the wind. And so I was pretty terrified, but I had taken my dad's advice. He said, look, don't make your decision about where to take your first job out of fear. Do what you want to do. And I had a lot of friends in New York, and so I did it. But at first I was scared. You know, every day I would take the subway into Grand Central Station. My law firm was right by Grand Central Station, and I kind of was a little bit afraid. Like, what if a bomb goes off on the subway? Well, I don't know what's going to happen. And I'm really glad I took my dad's advice there, because I had a fantastic experience in New York. I worked at a firm for a couple of years, and then I became a federal prosecutor in Brooklyn, New York. And that was so amazing. It was like a television show every day. So we had the mob. I did cases involving the mob. I did a murder case involving some members of the Gambino crime family, this cold case murder, that it was just fascinating, where literally like somebody was killed and their body was dumped in the ocean. It was like a TV show. I did international narcotics trafficking there, and it was just amazing. Great experience. And then I went to the Netherlands and worked at a war crimes tribunal. I worked as a prosecutor, prosecuting ethnic cleansing in Kosovo at a UN war crimes tribunal. And that was another leap. So being in a foreign country, I was living in the Netherlands. A lot of similarities in culture, but a lot of differences too. So that was an adjustment. And there were lawyers from all over the world. So we had different rules of procedure than I was used to, and different ways of doing things. So that was an adjustment. And I had to learn all about, you know, the atrocities that happened in the late 90s in Kosovo, which were really horrific, and figure out how to kind of balance doing that work, but also not letting it make me jaded or depressed as I did it. And so I tried to find that balance, and I traveled all over Europe while I was there, because in Europe, they've got really good work-life balance. And so there's no working on weekends unless you really have to. So I traveled all over the place, and then came back to Utah. After that trial was over, I was there for 3 years, came back to Utah, joined the U.S. Attorney's Office here as a federal prosecutor. Justice Hagen was the chief of our appellate section there. That's when we met, when I went in to ask her a Fourth Amendment question, I think.
That's right.
That's when we first met. And then after being there for 3 years, there were some openings on the state court bench, which I thought, I can't apply for that. I don't have any political connections. But lo and behold, it's merit-based. Everybody's got an equal shot. So I applied. After 3 tries, I got on the trial court bench, and then on the Supreme Court after I was there for a couple years. So, yeah.
So here's the thing. Anytime you have a career story competition, she always wins. I mean, she has been a war crimes prosecutor in Europe. She's gone after the mob in New York. But you've all noticed she's nice, right? So just a word of advice to all of you business leaders: it's the really smart, nice lawyers you have to watch out for. They are the most effective. It's absolutely true. The mean ones, you're like, okay, I know what I got here. We're all good, because nobody likes mean people. But she was really good as a lawyer. So now I'm going to go to you, Justice Hagen, recognizing, of course, that the rest of us are mere mortals.
I know. It's, you know.
But tell us about your career story.
That's the hard thing. Justice Pullman and I always have to follow that story, so it's a little bit tricky. I never, ever thought I was going to be a lawyer. I didn't know any lawyers. I was a first-generation college graduate. It just never occurred to me. I was going to be a movie star, is what I was going to be. I even went to University of Southern California in Los Angeles because that's where I was going to be discovered. And I studied acting for a while as an undergraduate, and then it's funny, we keep talking about merit-based selection, and I started to become suspicious that perhaps acting was not a merit-based selection process. I really wanted to do something that I felt like if I worked hard at and I got better, I could actually know where my next job was and not rely on the next audition. So it occurred to me that maybe I wanted to be like a public information officer or a spokesperson or do some kind of public speaking. So I transferred to the University of Utah and I changed my major to speech communication. And fortunately for me, there was a list of classes that you had to take for speech communication, and one was called Freedom of Expression. And I didn't know what it was, but it turned out to be a First Amendment law course. And we ended up reading all of those Supreme Court decisions on the First Amendment and free speech, and I was so inspired. I had never thought about a career in law, and luckily one of my classmates mentioned one day that she was about to take the LSAT. I'm like, what is that? And she said, oh, it's like the ACT, but it's a test you take to go to law school. I thought, oh, there's a test you take to go to law school? Fabulous. So I'll try it. I'll see if I have any aptitude for it. So I graduated, I got married, I went on my honeymoon, I took the LSAT the day after I got home from my honeymoon. I had to first, the day I got home, go to the DMV and get a new ID with my married name so it would match, so they'd let me take the LSAT the next day. And I applied to the University of Utah. We were going to stay here because at the time, my new husband, I believe, was an assistant manager at Musicland. I don't bet most of you don't know what Musicland is. But it was like a physical store in the mall that sold like the contents of iTunes in little packages. So, but to us, we were in our early 20s. We thought that was a really, really good job, and there was no way we were going to, walk away from the assistant manager of Musicland job to go to law school. So I applied to the U and the U only, and we made a decision that I was only going to go if I got a scholarship, and I did. So I went and I almost dropped out my first semester. I thought I was completely out of my league. I thought I'm not as smart as these people. There were people in law school, I'm sure you've encountered them in your education, the gunners, the ones that want to show how good they are and kind of psych everybody else out. And I thought, oh my gosh, I should not be here. I don't know what I was thinking. And fortunately, my very supportive husband said, just finish your first semester, and just see how it goes. And I thought, all right, yeah, but I'm going to drop out after I get my grades. I got my grades. I was first in my class after my first semester. I would never have guessed it in a million years. I always tell law students, you might be doing better than you think. So hang in there. And luckily, I did well enough that I got my first summer job at the firm that John Hafen and that has sponsored this event today, Parr Brown. I was so fortunate, and because I had been inspired to go to law school based on my First Amendment class, I was thrilled that at Parr Brown there was an attorney named Jeff Hunt who did media law. He used to be a reporter, and that was kind of his specialty. He represented the Deseret News, he represented the Society of Professional Journalists, so I was thrilled. So that's where I started out. I worked there during the summer. I went back there after I did a clerkship for a federal judge who, speaking of circles and speaking of mentors and the helpers, she was critical in my professional development. And when I used to work for her, she used to tell me that she was a federal prosecutor, and she used to tell me it was the best job in the world. And I thought, oh, I'm not interested in criminal law. Criminal law, worst grade in law school. I have no interest. I'm going to go and do First Amendment law at this great law firm, and it's going to be great. But when I started practicing law, I realized I didn't so much like the business of practicing law. The law firm wasn't a great fit for me, even though there were great attorneys and great mentors and people who really supported me, like John and others. But it just wasn't quite the right fit. So after I'd been there for about a year and a half, I got a call from the judge I had clerked for. And she said, you're such a good writer, and I know you loved moot court in law school. It's where you do like appellate type arguments. And I just found out that the U.S. Attorney is going to start a dedicated appellate section at the U.S. Attorney's office. And you would be perfect, and I've already called him. I've told him all about you, and he's expecting your resume. And I said, oh, I don't know. I really do have this wonderful job. I have these great opportunities. I'd like to stay here. I'd like to maybe make partner. And she said, these opportunities don't come around very often. And thank goodness she told me that. I, at the time, did not realize what a unique opportunity and what a sought after opportunity it was to become a federal prosecutor. So I submitted my resume, I got hired, and I did appellate work. So I did the cases generally after the trial was over and it was appealed to the 10th Circuit that sits in Denver. I would brief the case and argue it to a panel of judges in the 10th Circuit. But I also had the opportunity to do some trial work as well. When we had a high-profile trial or we had a really novel legal issue, the U.S. Attorney would like to put me on the trial case so that I could make sure that we did it correctly, we protected our record, we made good law. So I got the opportunity to work on some really neat cases. I worked on the Elizabeth Smart case for 2 years. I ended up doing all of the if you don't know, that was a kidnapping of a 14-year-old girl in Utah. She was taken for 9 months. And the real issue at trial was whether her kidnapper was first competent to stand trial, and then second, whether he was legally insane. So I put on all the expert witnesses, cross-examined them, was able to do the closing argument. My very last case before I left the U.S. Attorney's Office was a murder trial involving a female police officer who was killed during a traffic stop. And her murderer was actually acquitted in state court, and we ended up taking the case federally and proving that he had, in fact, committed the crime. So that was very rewarding as well. I always think about that when I think about how many times I was rejected for the Court of Appeals. So I applied, I think 7 times, and actually went up to the governor and was interviewed, went through the commission process, got on the final list, went up to the governor and didn't make it that many times. And sometimes I think about that and think, well, if I hadn't though, if it hadn't worked out this way, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to work on those cases. I wouldn't have had the opportunity to experience all the things I had in my career. So I think it worked out just perfect. So I did get appointed to the Court of Appeals. I joined Justice Pullman. We became fast friends on the Court of Appeals. And as we mentioned, Justice Peterson was already a friend from the U.S. Attorney's Office. So I have to pinch myself sometimes that I actually have the opportunity to work with these ladies who I truly love and admire and respect so much. And then last year, we had 2 retirements from the Utah Supreme Court, and Justice Pullman and I both applied, and we thought, what are the chances that maybe we could both get it? And we knew. And
I'm like,
we knew it was a long shot, and I ended up getting the first one, and I was so happy, but honestly, one of the hardest things was I really loved my Court of Appeals colleagues, and so when the second opening was filled by Justice Pullman, I honestly think that was the happiest day of my life because I was now done with my Senate confirmation and all the scary parts and the press conference, and now I just got to enjoy watching my friend come and got to continue to work with this amazing group. So that's my story.
It's a great story. Thank you.
It really is hard to follow. We did this a few months ago, and I got to go first with my career story, and I think it was a good trajectory. Mine's a little boring, and as we kind of continued to improve as we went this direction. I will say, just to follow on something just as Hagen just said, we did joke when we were applying for the court that maybe we should tell the governor we were a pair. He could have both of us or neither of us. We didn't get quite brave enough to do that, but we were thrilled that we were able to move to the Supreme Court together. So my career story began when I was really young. I was a student at Nibley Park Elementary, which is a school here in South Salt Lake, and I was in a program called Horizons. And they would take us out of our classroom a couple times a week and just kind of do some extracurricular type things, study some different subject areas, like we talked about enigmas, we did a science project, all kinds of things. But one of the projects when I was in 4th grade was the law. And my teacher taught us about how laws were made. We talked about the different branches of government, and we talked quite a bit about the judiciary. And we went to a courthouse, which was not the Matheson courthouse. That wasn't there at the time. It was over in Library Square, but we went and visited that courthouse and got to see some judges and some lawyers. And I was just immediately struck by how cool I thought the system was. I didn't have lawyers in my family. I didn't grow up in a neighborhood of lawyers, but I thought the system was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. And we did a mock trial. I was the defendant. I was convicted of theft. But I still thought it was so great. And I would tell everyone beginning at age 9 that someday I was going to be a lawyer and eventually a judge. And it's a little funny, Justice Hagen and I sometimes find ways that our worlds didn't cross paths, but we were similar in certain ways. When I was her age, or when I was 9, I did community theater and loved the idea of being an actress. But somehow at age 9, I decided that was impractical. And so I remember sitting there thinking I could be an actress or a lawyer. And I thought, well, it kind of was the epiphany she had after college. I somehow had at age 9. But at age 9, I thought, all right, this is going to be my career path. So I sat out with that trajectory in mind, studied really hard in school. In fact, I loved it so much that I'll tell you a little story that my colleagues have had to hear a couple times too many. But when I was in 6th grade, I convinced all my friends to play the People's Court at recess. Now, for those of you who are too young, it's similar to a Judge Judy, and I think there's shows on TV now where judges are on TV, but this Judge Wapner, he would bring in litigants, and they would present their cases, and if you remember it, Doug Llewellyn would interview them at the end of the case and find out if they were happy or sad. And I thought it was the coolest thing to make up a story, and I would get my friends to play. So I would say, you're the defendant, you're the plaintiff, you're Doug Llewellyn, you are the cameraman, you're the witness, you're Judge Wapner. And I would make up some scenario and tell each side just a little bit of a different story. And then they would come up and present their case, and the 6th grade judge would decide, and then we'd play it all over again. And I remember at some point, it seemed like the entire 6th grade was out there on the field saying, I want in. So anyway, I loved the law so much. So I set my sights for that. I went to law school, or I went to undergrad up at the U, studied political science and communication, which are both great backgrounds for entering law school. And then I applied to law school, and I applied to 3 schools. I applied to the U, I applied to the University of Chicago, and I applied to Stanford. And I remember living in a house up by the U, and there were these 2 guys that lived in the downstairs part of the house, and my roommate and I lived in the upstairs part, and they were going to law school at the time. And I would always tell, there's like, what are you going to do? And I say, I'm going to law school. And they say, well, you're going to try to go to law school. They were so obnoxious, and I would say, well, yeah. And so they said, well, where are you applying? And I told them, and they just rolled their eyes. They thought it was the most ridiculous thing they'd ever heard, that I was applying to these schools. But I loved telling them when I got into those schools. So that was a wonderful moment. But I decided to go to the U. The U is a fantastic law school. And, I was listening to Sarah talk about defining your own success. At the time I went to law school, I wanted to be a prosecutor. It's all I ever wanted to be. I think I really just wanted to be on Law & Order, so maybe I should have. That would have combined my acting skills and my desire to be a lawyer. I maybe should have followed Justice Peterson's path over there in the New York, Brooklyn district, but I wanted to be a prosecutor, and so I made a decision. What does success look like for me? Maybe these law schools are ranked higher, maybe they're more prestigious, but if I'm going to be a prosecutor, I'm not going to make a lot of money. And I don't want to have a huge amount of debt on my back. So I decided to go to the U, and it ended up being the best decision I ever made. Got a fantastic education there. And I started law school. I remember kind of the opposite of Justice Hagen. I went in and I said, where is my criminal law class? What is torts? What are contracts? What's property? This stuff is so boring. I'm not interested in all. I just want criminal law. And we didn't get one until our second semester of our first year. And so finally that came. I still was thinking, yes, I'm going to be a prosecutor. I applied to work for the U.S. Attorney's Office my first summer, got a position there for a few months and loved it. Got to work on a big trial and was just still sure that's what I was going to be. During my second year, I had just gotten married and law firms were up on campus interviewing. And all of a sudden I thought, well, I need to pay rent, I need to pay insurance, I need to make some money, and these law firms are here and they're offering money, and I'm sure I'll hate it, but I'll go ahead and do it for a summer, I'll make a little bit of money, and then I'll know I hate it and I'll never have to do it again. So I was fortunate enough to get an offer from a law firm called Stoll Reeves, similar to Sarah's law firm, a regional-based law firm here in Salt Lake. It was pretty new at the time, it had about 13 lawyers. And I accepted the job there, ended up working for them through my law school year and also my summer, and just fell in love with it. And more than anything, I think I fell in love with the people there. There's some fantastic, fantastic people who were just so in love with the work they did, just really enjoyed it, and taught me so much and gave me great opportunities. So I ended up accepting an offer from them to come back after law school. I clerked a year after law school in the federal district court with a wonderful man named Judge Winder. I learned so much from him, fantastic mentor. Really enjoyed my year there, and then joined the law firm and ended up spending 19 years there, which if you had told me that as a 9-year-old, if you had told me that going into law school, coming out of law school, I never would have believed it, but I really enjoyed my time there. I didn't get to prosecute war criminals. I didn't get to prosecute kidnappers. I probably would have loved that. But I did get to work on a number of interesting cases. I got to work on, we had the 2002 ethics scandal with the Olympics. One of my mentors was assigned to investigate that and write an ethics report, and I got to help with that as a young lawyer, and it was so much fun. I got to work on a case with the Deseret News and the Salt Lake Tribune. Their ownership were fighting for a number of years about the control of the papers, and so I got to work on that and got to travel around the country and meet really interesting people and work with really fantastic lawyers, and that was a great experience. And then I got to just do a variety of things. We represented a couple of families that had really tragic accidents. They were kind of random cases that we took on, but they meant so much to me because I really got to know these people and make a difference in their lives. Also got to do some pro bono work, which changed my life. I worked for a family of 4 from Colombia that came here escaping some political persecution there. Really feared for their lives, and I got to help them win an appeal in the Ninth Circuit and ultimately get asylum here. So even though I didn't anticipate those were the kind of cases I would work on, I really did enjoy my time there. And then mid-2000, I don't even know what it is, 2016, 2015, there were 2 openings on the Court of Appeals. And I'd always wanted to be a judge. You remember, 9th grade or 9 years old, I was ready. And I'd always pictured myself being a trial judge. I never really thought about the appellate courts. I did appellate work, but I was mostly a trial lawyer. And I thought about that job, and I thought, the things I love the most are researching, writing, thinking, just getting deep into the law. And I looked at that, and I had 3 young kids. And I thought, this might be a perfect job for me. I'll get to be a judge. I'll get to think about these really tricky issues. I'll get to write about them. But being on appellate court's a little more flexible. We're not on the bench all day, every day, like a trial court judge might be. And with my little kids, I thought maybe I could make this work with the way I still want to raise my kids and be around for them. And so I applied and got incredibly lucky. I got appointed by Governor Herbert. and convinced him that he needed a civil trial lawyer on the appellate bench. I said it's really important to have someone that has that experience, and it worked out just the right timing for me. And sat on that court for 6 years until I applied for the Supreme Court last year, or 2 years ago now. I mean, a year and a half ago. It feels like forever. But Justices Hagen and I were both a little bit almost dismayed when we heard there were openings, because we did really love our job so much. And all of a sudden, we then had to decide whether or not we wanted to apply and maybe make a change. But I'm glad I did that. It's been an incredible opportunity to be on the Supreme Court, and more than anything, to make a female majority. It's really not something I would have ever anticipated. Like Jonathan said at the beginning, when I was practicing, I was the only woman in the room almost all the time. Almost all the time. I was only a woman in my firm for quite a while. I was the first woman partner there. And you kind of get used to it, but it's not always fun. And I worked with some fantastic men and wonderful mentors. So don't get me wrong there, but it's so nice to be part of a group of women. And I was on the Court of Appeals. We made a woman majority there. When Justice Hagen joined, we have 7 on that court, and we, for the first time, had 4 women, 3 men, which was fantastic. And it's just wonderful to look around and have people you can relate to and talk about different issues that maybe some of your male colleagues don't have and can't relate to. So thrilled to be part of the court and thrilled to be part of this trio.
Awesome, thank you. So, if you had sued somebody or been sued, anybody here wouldn't feel great about having this majority of this highest court in the state and listen to your claim? I mean, it's absolutely incredible. So we're going to get now into some specific things, but it's pretty awesome to be able to get to know the majority of the Utah Supreme Court in this setting. So thank you for sharing those stories. That was great. Okay, next, Justice Peterson, coming back to you. As we all just heard, your life was filled with all kinds of unique settings, from Castledale to Salt Lake City to Ohio for your clerkship, New York City, The Hague. Can you tell us a little bit about the challenges and opportunities that you faced as a woman in those settings, and how you turned those challenges and opportunities into successes like Sarah talked about?
So, I always think it's hard to answer what challenges you have as a woman, because in a way, it's almost invisible, I think. I don't know what's because I'm a woman or not, right? It's like when I moved to the Netherlands, there's definitely just culturally, people are very direct. So I would, you'd go to a store and ask for something and they might say, it's not possible. And I'd think, do they kind of not like me because I'm an American? Or is this just how they would interact with any customer? I don't know. It's invisible. So a lot of these cultural kind of things, you don't know why you're getting the response that you're getting. But what I have noticed is that in the fields that I was in, as a criminal prosecutor, it's kind of a rough and tumble field in a lot of ways, and you're working with law enforcement, and they're mainly male, so that was a very male-dominated industry, and we always had criminal defense lawyers on the other side, and the criminal defense lawyers in New York, it's not as bad as you would think, right? You might think that it was kind of no holds barred. Actually, in criminal law, the lawyers are a lot nicer to each other because we see the same lawyers all the time. So the federal public defenders, I had a good relationship with all of them, but there were definitely some really tough defense lawyers that were sort of no holds barred. And the main thing I've gotten is that people would look at me and think, you don't seem like a prosecutor, or you don't look like a judge. You're not what I picture when I think of a criminal prosecutor. And so sometimes that would mean, with defense lawyers, they would say, well, this isn't how the other prosecutors do it in your office. This isn't what your office does. When I was new, And I got the same thing when I was starting on the district court. Well, this isn't how the other judges do it. And usually when I would follow up on that, it was never true. But it was something that people would say when you started out, like, well, nobody else is doing it like this. I have found ways to kind of use that as a strength. So as a prosecutor, people, if you're quite nice, you don't have everybody on guard ready to, waiting for your next move. You can sort of take people off guard, because I prosecuted the cases like anyone else would, but you wouldn't necessarily see it coming in the same way. And I remember one story. So one of the things we did in Brooklyn, in all prosecution offices, you have this. Sometimes what you'd want to do is prosecute whoever was most responsible for, if there's a big organization, you don't want to just get the little guys. You want to see, like, who's really at the top of this and how do we prosecute that person. So in the drug cases we would do, we weren't trying to prosecute, an individual dealer on the street or someone who was using drugs. That was not what we were looking for. We wanted, like, the person sitting on top, who was directing, who was pulling all the strings. And you needed to get people in the middle to tell you who that person was. So as those people would get arrested, you needed them to decide, I want to cooperate and become a witness. Because otherwise, without those people telling you what was happening, you would never know really who was at the top. So there was a person who'd been arrested. He was a big distributor of drugs. He was a truck driver, and he would have like a truck full of drugs from Mexico and then like some cabbage at the end or something, like hiding all the drugs. So he got arrested, and we knew he was working in this organization for someone who was directing it from Mexico, and we really needed a witness who could tie all of these drugs to the source, this person who was in charge. And another prosecutor had had this case, and he was switching or quitting or something, and so it got turned over to me, and he said, he won't cooperate, so you're just going to have to go to trial. And I started listening. We had all of that the prosecutor who handed the case to me had recorded a lot of the jail calls of this person from jail. They all get recorded. And I met with the guy. He didn't want to cooperate. But I started listening to these jail calls, and it became clear to me that this defendant really hated the former prosecutor. And these were all in Spanish, so we had these translations. And then after our meeting, he had said on the phone to someone, there's a new prosecutor, and I'm going to put the honey to her. And I thought, I don't know what that means, but I think he thinks he's gonna try to have his lawyer sweet talk me, this innocent girl, into giving him a good deal. And I thought, aha, I'm gonna put the honey to him. So at our next meeting, it hadn't worked when the former person had, he'd used all these heavy-handed tactics trying to make this guy cooperate. And so I just said, you do not have to cooperate with us. It is always your choice. I would love it if you did. And here's why. This person who's at the top of this is causing such trouble. It would really, really mean a lot to us if you could honestly tell us what happened. But it's your choice. Guess who became a fantastic cooperator? So I would think, I'm not ever going to seem like this fierce prosecutor who's going to spark fear in people. But maybe that's also a good thing. And so these are my strengths. I'm going to use my strengths. And the same thing as a judge. I think one of the things that's that's tougher for women is we have a more narrow window of behavior that people find acceptable. So, as a judge, if you are a crotchety, grouchy judge, which lots of men can be crotchety old judges, right? And that's fine. Oh, Judge so-and-so, that's just how he is. But if you're that way as a woman, you know what you get called. You know the B word. On the other hand, if you're too nice, you're a pushover. She can't control her courtroom. She's too nice. And so in the trial court, this was the area where I'd get, people would say, you can't let people get away with that. You've got to really come down on them. And I'd think, I can't pretend I'm mad about something that I'm not mad about. Like, there are things that make me mad, and I have lines that I'm going to draw, but I'm also not going to pretend I'm mad to act like I'm a tougher judge. I have to be me up there. And it worked, but I did get that pushback. And I definitely felt like those limits, oh, can't go there, oh, can't be too nice. And so I think that's something that I've definitely felt. And I don't know, I'm not sure if that's still the same in your generation, if you're finding this today. I feel like this shifts every generation. It's a little different for people. It's much easier for us than the woman whose position I took on the Supreme Court after she retired. When she was coming up, law firms just openly had a policy, we don't hire women. And they were open about that. Women need not apply. Women weren't really regularly even allowed in law schools until the 1950s. So we have it way better than that. And I think it probably changes every generation, but it is interesting to see how people respond to you. And I do just think you have to be authentic and be yourself and figure out, well, these are my strengths. I need to use my strengths. If I try to be something different, I'm not going to be as good, because I'm going to be not actually being myself. So I have to be the best version of me. Not that I can't learn new things or new techniques, but I have to do it as me. So.
Outstanding, thank you. So I want to talk now about leadership. One of the things that's interesting about the Supreme Court, they don't just decide cases for people, they also run the judicial branch of government. So they're responsible for all of the lawyers in the state and how the judicial process works. It's a really big job, and all three of these presenters today are incredible leaders. And so Justice Hagen, I want to ask you about leadership. What are the attributes, in your experience, the attributes of an effective leader and the attributes of, I guess you could say, an ineffective leader, but if somebody's really that ineffective, I'm not sure they're a leader, but they may hold a position of authority. So let's talk about that. What's your perspective?
All right. Well, I think one of the key differences between good leaders and poor leaders are that good leaders really lead by example. They have a vision, and they also have integrity. They know what's important, and they demonstrate that through their work. When I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office before I became a judge, I ended up getting promoted to first assistant, which is the position right below the presidentially appointed U.S. attorney. And I had to take on a lot of management type roles, which was not my favorite, to be honest. I was very excited to get back to legal writing and not have performance reviews with struggling employees. But one of the things that we tried to really exemplify is that we would make the right decision and we would do the right thing and what justice required, even if it was really hard. Even if it meant that, the evidence was developing in a way that we weren't going to be able to prove this case at trial, right? And we had to go back to a victim or the victim's family and explain that. Or we would have a case where maybe there was a mistake at trial. Maybe something went wrong, and it was our fault. We might have led the district court into error, or something happened that violated the defendant's constitutional rights, and that we had to take responsibility for that and admit that we were wrong and fix it. There were often times when I would have to go to the 10th Circuit and say, this defendant did not get a fair sentencing hearing. You should send this case back to the district court. And really setting that as the expectation, that we're going to do the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it's uncomfortable. One of my biggest challenges when I was in that position is we had a really tragic situation where a federal defendant was let out on bail, let out on release, and while he was out on release, he killed a police officer. And it was devastating. We were devastated. The prosecutor was devastated. And what happened, though, is that the magistrate judge who had granted him the release was being vilified in the press and really being attacked for making this terrible decision that cost us the life of a police officer. And we knew that when we went into that hearing, we agreed that the defendant should be released, and that it was really unfair that she was getting all of this blowback when the prosecutors, that we had made the judgment as well that it was appropriate for this person to be released. And so we made a decision to issue a press release saying, these are really hard decisions, and this is what we asked for. This is not a rogue magistrate judge who made this decision. And given the anger in the community and how closely we work with law enforcement, that was hard to do, but it was the right thing to do. And so being willing to take those hits and do the right thing and show that. The other thing I think is really important about leadership is being willing to never asking people to do things that you wouldn't do yourself. When I would finish a brief and it had to be filed by midnight and I was done with what I could do as an attorney, you bet I was in the copy room helping my secretary make copies and bind those briefs and get them into envelopes because we're a team and that's what we do together. When we would have events and we would be asking some of our support staff and some of our employees to stay after to clean up. I didn't go home. I was there helping as well. And I noticed when the U.S. attorney and the other leadership in the office, I noticed when they did that. And that was really important. One other example I'll give, and then I'll tie up, is, in terms of promoting sort of a vision and what you want your culture to be. When I was president of Women Lawyers of Utah, one of the things that I had heard from some people was that although it was a great organization, some women felt like it was a little bit cliquey, that it was hard to break into, that everyone knew each other, and so it was hard to go to these events and because people were just grouped together in the groups of people that they already knew. And one of the other things I heard is that women who didn't drink alcohol felt like some of our events were cocktail parties, and it wasn't. It just didn't feel like the kind of environment that everyone was included in, or that women from outside of the Salt Lake Valley didn't necessarily feel included. And so, one of our primary missions was to have this inclusion and to build everybody up. So as president, when we would go to these different networking events, one of the things I would do is I'd have all the board members wear a name tag, and I would say, you can't talk to anyone you know. You can, but your job as a board member is to go up to people who you don't know and make them feel welcome and make them feel included. And we started, if we were doing an evening thing with cocktails, we started having mocktails too, so that everyone could have a fancy drink and we could all socialize, and that people felt like we were making an effort to include all women. And we started going to different events. In fact, Sarah, I believe, organized the one in Logan that we went to, and met with women up there. We found out that there were exactly 22 women who were attorneys in Logan, and I thought, wow, we need to bring them in to the group. So just kind of modeling the kinds of values that you want and what you want to see, and making those sort of intentional efforts to create the kind of culture that you want to see as a leader.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Okay, Justice Pullman. So Sarah talked about success, and I want to pair the concept of success with leadership that Justice Hagen just talked about. So how do we define what success is, and how do we get there?
Great question. And I loved hearing what Sarah had to say, because I've been thinking about this question overnight. And I really do think success is what you define it to be. It's achieving those goals that you set for yourself. And one thing that's interesting about the legal field in particular, and I'm sure this is true in other fields as well, is you kind of look at it and feel like the way you succeed is already defined, right? It's in my law firm, it was being on the first page of the comp sheet, right? Which meant you were making the most money, number one. Excuse me. The number one person was the one making the most. And if you could make it, my firm as a regional firm, had maybe like 400 lawyers. So if you could make that top page, excuse me. There we go. If you could make the top page, you had succeeded. If you could get into firm management, that was a definition of success. And I'm sure that's true in a variety of fields. And as I got into the law firm, as you recall, I didn't really ever picture myself as a firm lawyer. So it's not like I grew up thinking, I want to make the most money I can possibly make, or I want to be on the top of the comp sheet, or I want to be in firm management. All of a sudden, I just found myself in this place I loved, doing work I loved, but was all of a sudden faced with this idea that I had these benchmarks I needed to achieve in order to be successful. And so I had to kind of break out of that a little bit and be okay with that. I remember going to a firm conference once. We'd get together once a year. And they had a meeting with just the women. And they had one of our female partners from Portland get up, and she spoke. And she was incredibly successful. She was on the front page of the comp sheet. But as she sat and described how she got there and kind of what her life looked like, I remember thinking, I don't ever want to be on the front page of the comp sheet. Even though that's what I'm supposed to be aspiring to, and that's what all of these evaluations kind of talk about every year, I just thought, that's not what I want. That's not why I became a lawyer. It's not why I went to law school. And so how am I going to define success for myself? And I really had to think hard about that. And every year when we would do evaluations, it was always tricky. Because even though I kind of could get comfortable in my own skin with how I was going to define success for me, I'd have to fill out these forms every year that I felt were directed toward kind of this different view of success. So to be honest, I kind of faked my way through those a lot, and I would think, I am successful because I am doing excellent work in the work that I want to do. I am the best lawyer that I think I can be. I am supporting my colleagues. I am supporting my clients. I am finding clients that I care about, and I care about their issues. And if I can succeed in bringing them success, then I am successful. The other thing I did, I was married pretty young and wanted to have kids, but it took me some time to have children. And so I had worked at the firm for a good 7 years, I think, before I got pregnant with my first child. And I loved to work. I really did. I was just kind of one of those people that really was excited about my cases, didn't mind working nights and weekends. I just really enjoyed it. And all of a sudden, though, I was going to be a mom. And I said to myself, what does this look like? I don't know what this looks like. And again, I was at a firm, my local firm anyway, no women to kind of model myself after. And I thought, I can't keep billing these kind of hours and working at this kind of pace and be the kind of mom I want to be. And so luckily my firm, again based out of Portland and Seattle, was a bit progressive and had a reduced schedule policy. And so I started to look at that, and I thought, all right, I want to keep working, because a lot of the women I knew that had been in the legal field, once they had children, they would just leave, right? It was too hard to manage. And I could see those pressures, and I thought, I don't want to be completely out of this work, but I also know I can't do it the way I want to do it, and also be the kind of mom I want to be. So I sat down with my practice group leader out of Seattle, and I said, I want to go on a reduced schedule. I want to work 60%. I want to work 2 days a week in the office, 3 days a week from home, which post-COVID would have been no big deal. But pre-COVID, people think that seems a little nuts. But I said, I think I can make this work. And I've been doing this job for 7, 8 years. I know how to do the work. I know how to do it on my own from home. I can work it out so I'm not first chairing cases, so that I'm not the one that has to be at every court hearing or every client meeting. But I can make this work. And I remember him sitting with me in my kitchen. I had a new baby. And he said, you know, I don't think this will work. He said, but I'm going to let you try. And I'm so grateful for that guy who said, you know, and he was honest with me. I just don't think this will work. I've seen people try to be away from the office this much. It doesn't usually work. But you're unique. You're your own person. You're in your own circumstance. You've got your own skills. I'm going to let you try. And it worked. I worked a 60% schedule, which honestly ended up being more like an 80% schedule. But I got paid 60, worked 80. You know how these things go. But I did that. I had 3 children, and I did that for the span of 6 or 7 years as I was having my babies. And it did work. And it worked in part because I had really supportive people around me. It worked because I was willing to put everything I could into that. I had a lot of late nights, a lot of sleepless nights. I remember being at parties where I'd run out to my car, get on the Wi-Fi, be like, kids, I'll be right back into the birthday party. I mean, there were things that were very uncomfortable and not fun. But I also was able to be home with my kids and volunteer at school and do all those things that I wanted to do. And it's because I was able in my mind to redefine success, because that's not what success looked like to the outside world most of the time. And I really worried when I went to apply to be on the court. I thought, this is what's going to keep me off the court. My youngest was just about to go into kindergarten, and so I was already thinking maybe I'm going to go back, and I'll go back 100%, and I'm going to have to do that for 5 or 6 years so that the people evaluating me will say, oh, okay, she's a real lawyer again, right? And so I wouldn't say I advertised it, but I also didn't hide it, right? I talked about I had been on this reduced schedule, but I didn't try to minimize the work I had done. I made it clear that I thought I was still a fantastic lawyer who did great work, and still did all the things the lawyers do. I just did it on a slightly different schedule. And it was never an issue, and I was so happy about that. And once I got on the court, then I was shouting it far and wide, because I wanted to say to people, just go out and be the success you want to be. Do the great work that you know you can do, but it might look a little different. Your path might look different. Your schedule might look different. But figure out how you're going to define success, because if I had gotten on that front page of the comp sheet, I would have a much bigger house and nicer cars and better jewelry, but I wouldn't be defining it as successful for me. It's not what I wanted in my life. And if that is what you want, I mean, I'm not trying, that's great. Like, just figure out what will make you happy. And I tried to do that. And I feel like as I look back, my kids are now, 12, 15, 17. And I think about those times I was at school with them and on the field trips and volunteering. And I'm so, so grateful I had those moments. And I'm so glad that I was able to figure out how to both be a great lawyer, but also spend that time with my kids while they were young. So to me, success is what you make it.
That's great. Thank you. Every one of these answers, I just want to give a standing ovation, which is easy since I'm already standing, but I also feel like each one of these answers can be like a really good chapter in a book about how we should live our lives. So we still got some time. I got some more great questions. Next one, I want to go back to what we started with a bit. We have this momentous happening where we have a female majority Supreme Court. We've talked about the fact that we had a majority of women on the appellate court. So Justice Peterson, I'm going to direct this one to you. What does this mean to the people of Utah? What does this mean to you? How did it happen?
Okay, can I answer that plus add something to the last question?
One of the nice things about being on the Supreme Court and talking to a lawyer is that you can do whatever you want. So yes, please.
Okay, I just want to follow that. Justice Pullman's answer just made me think of so many things. And as I walked in and Sarah was talking, I loved what you were saying, Sarah, about finding your own strengths. So I sometimes think if I look at my resume now, or if I hear someone introduce me and give my bio, it's almost like it's another person. I almost feel like she sounds amazing. I would like to meet that woman. Because the actual living of it was very different than just this straight path from point A to B to C to D. And it was punctuated by periods where I really didn't know what I wanted to do next. And I did lots of soul searching and even kind of felt paralyzed at times, not knowing, should I do this or should I do that, and where it would lead. And so it's like looking at someone's Facebook page or their Instagram page, that's what a resume is. But there's a lot of twists and turns along the way. So when I was deciding after law school whether to move to New York, or I had an offer in California, that almost killed me making that decision because it seemed like two such different lives. And so I wanted a crystal ball to tell me, like, well, what friends will I make here and what friends will I make there? Is my soulmate in California? Will I miss meeting him and you don't know these things. I will tell you all this. This is something I don't talk about that much because it's not really relevant, but with a group full of women, I want you all to know this. So after work, when I was working in Brooklyn, and ended up going to the Netherlands, which ended up being an amazing experience for me. The reason I went there didn't work out at all. So I went there because I had gotten engaged to someone who got a job there. So I moved there too. I left my job in Brooklyn and I went to the Netherlands without a job. And for the first little while, I felt totally lost because I had been this federal prosecutor in Brooklyn. I had emails and phone calls coming at me all the time. And then I was just this person like walking around, sitting in coffee shops, applying for jobs. And it got a lot better once I got the job in the War Crimes Tribunal, but that was by no means certain. I had a lot of soul searching there. And then the engagement didn't work out. I realized, I don't think it's going to work to marry this person. And so we broke up and he moved back to the United States and I stayed there for a couple of more years. But it wasn't my plan to go there in the first place. It was something that didn't work for the reasons I did it. And then when I got there, I loved it and I was so happy I had that opportunity, even though it didn't work for the reasons I'd planned, and became one of the best experiences in my life. And I stayed there for 2 years by myself and traveled all over and had this amazing experience. So when my trial ended, I decided, well, I'll move back to Utah because all of my family is here. And I was single at the time. And by the way, I was 39. So I don't know, those of you I was in a panic. Let's just say that. I think everyone in this room, I thought, oh my gosh, if you would have told me at 20 that I will be 39 and single, I couldn't have gone on. Like I was in a panic at 39. Because I'd broken off this engagement. I didn't have any other, prospects in the hopper. And so I was thinking, when am I going to have kids? I want to have a family. I want to have kids. So I was having the total biological panic. I thought, I'm going to move back to Utah and everyone will think I'm a total weirdo because I'm 39 and single. They're going to think, what is up with this woman? What is her story? But I came back and again, I was thinking, what do I want to do now? I'm 39, I've been a prosecutor. Do I want to keep doing that? Do I want to try something else? So I had this, again, kind of soul searching about what is my path. And one thing I figured out is, I think in every career there are these things that are prestigious, or the thing to do that is validated. And that would just trip me up. And what I thought is, I have to make the most Paige decision I can. The thing that is most me, that is me making the best decision for me. So what am I interested in? What do I want to be good at? One of my friends said, if you find a job and you really want to be good at that job, hallelujah, like hold on to that, because that's huge. There's so many things out there that you do it and you're like, I don't care about this and I don't want to be doing it. If you have something and you really want to be good at it, that's a great sign. What do I want to be good at? What are my skills? What talents do I have to bring? And I ended up getting a job in the U.S. Attorney's Office here. I applied for a couple other things that didn't quite work out. So again, I'm having a little bit of a panic, because at this point I'm like a 40-year-old who's looking for a job. And I'm kind of thinking, I'm like making a mess of my life. I'm not doing these things that I need to be doing. And I got a job at the U.S. Attorney's Office and met the most amazing group of people here in Utah, who are still all my close friends. And now to hear it told, it sounds like it was just this smooth sailing path where I just knew where I was going and I just marched up that path. But that was not true along the way. So I sometimes want to give that caveat to people and say, like, I would never want anyone to hear, oh, look at all the, you hear the accomplishments of other people and you think, oh, I'm not measuring up. So many times along that path, I felt like I'm not measuring up. I'm embarrassed to go to my law school reunion because I don't have a job right now. What am I going to tell people I'm doing? So we all feel that way, and it's just, you've got to make the most you decisions you can make, and you've just got to really think about, well, what is the right decision for me? And that is how you chart your path. Okay. Now.
That was awesome.
So, do we have time for me to answer your other question,
Yeah, I
or are we
think
out?
we have questions and answers till 12:15, so we got 20
Okay.
minutes, and I'm just going to keep
Great.
going. I got great stuff here, but if any of you all have questions, let me know. But lunch is on the horizon. I could just keep on going, because I'm just telling you, stuff like this is incredibly rare. It's such a huge opportunity. I want to keep going. Everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
I
Okay.
should know, I think.
Yeah,
Oh.
go ahead.
I just wanted, I've been coming to these this whole year, and I've never spoken up before. I'm kind of just sit in the back and listen, but I just want to thank you, ladies, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here today and to share your experiences with how you started and how you climbed up the legal ladder and where you're at today, and just, you're very inspiring, and I just appreciate that you guys are here with all of us today.
Well said.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is incredible, and this is something that Pat and I talked about. When did we email you? Like 5 months ago?
A while back.
Because if you don't do that, you're not getting, especially getting all three of them, and these folks all speak not just in Utah but around the country, and so this is amazing to have them here. All right, Justice Hagen, you're up
Yes.
next.
Okay.
Because I'm going to skip the other question.
Okay, all right.
Because I think we've talked about it.
All
So
right.
there's some other
It's
stuff.
awesome. It's great that we have a female majority.
There we go.
Yes,
What you
Love
said,
it.
what you said was more important.
it was, I'd like to.
So let's kind of stick with that theme. One of the things, you hear about work-life balance, everybody hears about work-life balance. One of the things that Pat really promotes is getting away from that term, because it's just not a productive term. It's work-life harmony, that's what she calls it. And I know your family, Justice Hagen, you're an incredible mom, incredible wife, you're a busy lawyer, now busy justice. So how have you found work-life harmony. What advice do you have for all of us on how to achieve that elusive goal?
I do think that's a better term, because if you're trying to find balance, you'll never find it. There's always times that your family or your personal life is going to take center stage, and you just have to adjust as things come your way. So harmony's a great way to say it. It's interesting. I always wanted. I knew I wanted to be a mom. I had an interesting experience when I was young. When I was very young, my mother and father were divorced when I was about 3, and we were poverty stricken. We were on welfare. We were really, really struggling. But my mother had a really hard time putting me in daycare. And she ended up being able to get this job where she could take me to school in the morning and then pick me up after school. And she had just kind of made it work so that she could be there for me, but that she could also find ways to support our family. And it had like a kind of a profound impact on me, that my well-being was that important to her, and that's how she figured out how to balance it. So I knew that I didn't want to be gone all the time when my kids were young. I knew that if I was at a law firm and working full-time, that was extremely demanding. I was going to be gone a lot. So even when I clerked for my federal judge, Tina Campbell, I used to tell her, I'd really like to someday find a job where I could work from home part of the time, so that I can just be present and take a break for lunch, spend the time with my kids, that sort of thing. And so one of the things when she called me that day and told me about the appellate position at the U.S. Attorney's Office, is she said, this would be a perfect job to work from home, because you're not in court every day, you're not meeting with witnesses and victims, you're writing and doing that sort of thing. So I had that in my mind. So when I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office, I was pregnant with my first child about 3 or 4 years in. And I had worked really hard to try to make myself very, very valuable, so that they would not want to lose me, because I knew this ask was coming. I had this planned out. So I went to the U.S. Attorney and I said, I'd like to work from home part of the week. In fact, I asked for 1 day in the office and 4 days at home. And at the time he said, well, we've never done anything like that. And he said, you could go part-time. And I said, yeah, I can't really go part-time because I'm the primary earner in my family. I really can't afford to do that. But it would make a difference, when I'm still breastfeeding, to be at home. I live in Ogden. It's an hour commute. That's all time that I could spend with my family. And he said, yeah, I don't think we're going to do that. So again, Judge Campbell, to the rescue, said to me, all right, well, I know this is important to you. I will hire you back as a permanent law clerk, and I'll match your salary at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I will schedule all of the hearings that you need to be here for 1 day a week, and put a crib in your office so that you can even bring the baby, and my secretary will watch the baby while we're in court. And I mean, the most amazing offer, but she said, but it's not going to be the best decision for your career. It's going to change the trajectory of your career. She said, so take one more run at the U.S. Attorney's Office, because that's where you really should be. So I went and talked to the U.S. Attorney again, and it wasn't really going too well. And I said, okay, this really is important to me. I have this offer to go back and work for Judge Campbell. And he said, that'll end your career. That'll ruin your career. And I said, I know, but this really is important to me. He said, 2 days in the office. I said, done. And so I ended up doing that for the next 12 years. Off and on. When I was doing the Elizabeth Smart trial for those 2 years, I was more in the office, believe me. I actually went 1 day during the trial. I went 11 days without seeing my children awake, because I would be at work until about 11 or 12, and then I'd leave again before they woke up in the morning. But by that time, we had our second child. And we were using my mother and my mother-in-law to take care of the kids while I was working. And then it was great. You know, it'd be lunchtime and I'd go and have lunch with the kids. At 5 o'clock, I would end for that time, not for the day. I'd spend the next, 3.5 hours with them, put them to bed at 8:30, and got back into my home office and finish my work. And it was perfect. But when I was having my second child and I was going to have 2 children in diapers, 2 children under 2, I realized that maybe relying on my 70-something-year-old mother-in-law and mother was maybe a little bit too much. So I asked my husband to quit his job as a graphic designer and stay home. It was hard for him. He is a very gregarious person. He loves to be out with other people and involved in things. But he said yes, and I honestly think that made all the difference in my career. When I could join things like Federal Bar Association and Women Lawyers and Salt Lake County Bar, and I could do these things, and I knew that he was taking care of the kids. And I was still doing things. On those days I worked from home, I would take an hour off here and there and go and go to the class party and go on field trips and things like that. But when I had meetings, when I had work to do, I knew I could get up and I could have breakfast with my kids, and then I could go in my home office and close the door, and he had them. And I didn't have to worry about, my mom being sick or laying out their clothes for the day before the babysitter came over. And I had this flexibility that if I couldn't be home at 6, I would call and say, I have to work late. He'd say, I got it, and it was all taken care of. So I feel like so much of the things that I was able to do in my career and these opportunities I was able to take advantage of were because of that sacrifice. And so when people ask me what my secret is, I say, it's a stay-at-home spouse. I would watch sometimes at my law firm and I would think, how do these men do it? And then I'd think, oh, their wives are home. So that's what I wanted for myself. And it can be different for everyone, right? But that was how I found the balance and how I was able to really pursue a lot of professional opportunities and still be the mom I wanted to be and still know that my kids were taken care of. And it really made all the difference in the world. So there are paths to this. And one thing I have to mention at all of these kinds of things, we got together with all 5 women who had ever been justices on the Supreme Court recently, the two who have retired. And I found out that 4 out of the 5 of us had some kind of flexible work arrangement, a reduced schedule, telecommuting, things like that. And I thought, the talent and the leadership and the ability we would have lost if these women had not stayed in the law, it's just staggering to me to think. I mean, Justice Durham, who was such a pioneer in the law, she had a part-time arrangement when her kids were young. And it's sometimes a very short period of time. And having that type of flexibility lets you contribute. It lets you stay in your profession. It lets you become the future leaders of your profession. And it's just critical to remember that. Now, not everyone wants that. And not everyone needs that. Not everyone wants a flexible work opportunity. But for those of us who do, it can make all the difference in retaining talent and retaining amazing women in our professions.
Can I say one quick thing, just tailing on this? I want to tell you all 2 stories that really had an impact on me. So I think as women, we often feel this real pull, whether it's with your kids, like you're not doing anything enough. You feel like you're falling short everywhere because you're stretched too thin. And I think it's important to think about what a positive, great example you're setting when your kids see you doing things that they think are pretty meaningful and pretty cool. That's not just taking from your kids when you're off doing something. It's a positive example that you're setting of, my mom's doing a really valuable thing. So a woman that we worked with in the U.S. Attorney's Office, she, one day she was telling me that her son, he was in junior high school at the time, and he got hit in the head with a basketball and went to the nurse's office, and the nurse said, okay, we're worried about a concussion, we're gonna need to send you home. And he said to the nurse, well, you better call my dad because my mom's in court putting bad guys in jail. How cool that that son thinks my mom is kind of this superhero, like she's out putting bad guys away. And I went into a judge's office, Cara Pettit's office, a few years ago. She's a great judge on our district court. And she had this, crayon drawing on her wall that her youngest daughter had drawn. And it was a kind of a stick figure of someone that looked like Cara's color of hair, and she's up on a bench and she's in her black robe, and it said, my mom makes the laws. Now that's not actually accurate. We don't make the laws, we interpret the laws. But still, I thought, how cool, like this daughter's view of her mom. So don't forget that, like don't be overcome with guilt and thinking, oh, I'm not giving them everything that all of my time. Like seeing you do great things that you love and that are valuable, like that's positive, that's great. So don't forget that.
Awesome, thank you. And I also love the fact that we both of your stories, Justice Hagen, Justice Pullman, you were bold. You took some initiative. Your work schedule wasn't what you wanted it to be, and this, of course, is pre-COVID, but you went in and negotiated, and there's nothing wrong with that.
No.
Go in and negotiate, because when employers have really talented people like all of you, the fact that you're in this program, I know that you are valued by your employers because they nominated you to be in this program, and lawyers call that leverage. So, Justice Pullman, next question is for you. We talked some about mentoring, so I'm going to ask you about something that is really, really important, I think, to all of us, that we don't talk about a lot, and that is decision making. So you are a justice on the Utah Supreme Court, and in that role, you're making really important decisions on behalf of other people. Who wins, who loses, whether somebody goes to prison, how long they go to prison for. I mean, life and liberty and happiness. I mean, you are making decisions that impact other people, and then you have all the decisions in the rest of your life.
Right.
But you're trusted as a justice because you're good at making decisions. So what advice do you have for us on the decision-making process? How do you go about it? What do you do to strive to make the right decision?
That's a great question. I always say to my kids when it's time to figure out where we're going to have dinner, I say, I have decision fatigue. I make decisions all day, every day. It's a real thing. Google it. And I can't decide where we're going to go eat. You decide, which usually they're happy to do. But making decisions can be hard and it can be overwhelming. And I think for me, the things that are most important is just knowledge and I guess having the knowledge, right? First of all, getting all of the information you can. I've had people actually tease me before because I will research until the computer breaks. I just love to find out as much as I can about something before I make a decision on it. And usually what will happen is I'll research, I'll read, and then I'll have to put it away for a time because I'm moving on to something that has to be dealt with right away. I'll pull out my old things and I'll start researching again. And then sure enough, I'll find oh, I already found this case. Oh, I've already marked this up. Oh, I already read this part of the transcript. But I like to just make sure I have all of the information that I can possibly have. So I think whatever, the decisions we're making in our lives are, if we just make sure that we have all the information that's relevant and important. And sometimes in that search, I find things that are probably irrelevant and unimportant, but I want to make sure I have the universe that I need to have before I make a decision. And then it's just sitting down with that. And sometimes that information will make the decision obvious, right? I love it. Those are my favorite days on the bench when I've done all of that work and I feel like this light bulb literally goes off in my head and I'm like, that's the answer. Those are good days. Those were good days as lawyers when you could because of that prep work, you found the answer. It was just kind of handed to you. And that can happen. I think there are a lot of days, though, that you do all of that work, you do all of that searching, and the answer doesn't just open itself. There is no light bulb. You are sitting there thinking, all right, now I have to make a really hard decision. And I think especially on the Supreme Court, we find ourselves in that place a lot because we're making decisions on a lot of things that have never been decided before. So we find as much information as we can, we figure out all the rules that govern our decision, but we are still left at the end of the day with having to make a tough decision that we know will impact people's lives, both in the case we're deciding and potentially, for decades to come and influence so many people and affect so many people. And that's when I'm incredibly grateful that I have colleagues. I was glad I had colleagues at the law firm. I think I never was a solo practitioner. I think it would be incredibly hard to do that. There was nothing better than sitting down in the war room with my colleagues and hashing out, how do we make the best decision here for our client? Here are the pros, here are the cons, here are the risks, here are the rewards. Let's figure out what makes the most sense. And we do that now as a court, having 4 other great minds that I get to talk to. And we have our law clerks, we have a whole body of people that we get to work with. And I often say to my clerks, sometimes they don't even know a lot about the issue I'm working on, but I need them to sit there and listen to me and to kind of push back, because if I talk it through, sometimes those answers become more apparent. If I just try to do it in my head without having other people's input, I feel like I don't reach the best decision. And so there's nothing better, I think, than doing all that prep work, thinking about it so hard, but then getting together with other people who care and who are bright and who care about you, even if it's just my decision, but they're willing to kind of put their input in and figuring out together what the best possible solution is for any particular issue.
Awesome, that's fantastic, thank you. Okay, we've got time for one more question. So Justice Peterson, it's your turn. And I really wanted to get to this question. So you all heard the phrase gender dynamics? So that's what I want to ask about. So I wanted to make sure I got the question right, so I looked it up. Here's what gender dynamics is defined as on a really good study that was done. Gender dynamics refer to people treating men and women differently in ways that affect their power, status, and authority. And if I saw that happening, that would make me really angry. And I had an experience this week I want to tell you about, and then I'll ask you a question. I was talking to another female attorney in town. Thankfully, some of this is in retrospect, but I just said, hey, I'm having this great opportunity to meet with the justices and ask questions in front of a group of incredible women leaders, and just asked her a little bit about her experience in gender dynamics, and she said it was really hard. And I said, give me some examples. She said, well, one of the best examples was, it happened to me multiple times. I'd be in a room with the other lawyers in a client meeting. I'd have a senior lawyer that would be a man. I would be a woman attorney kind of in the middle, mid-level, and then there'd be a couple of male brand new associates. And when it was time for somebody to go get water, get a drink or something, the senior lawyer would say, oh, can you go get drinks for everyone? And she just said, I felt like that was incredibly unfair. Well, that is negative gender dynamics. And then yesterday, I love having women on my legal teams for my cases. I try to always have one on my team if I can, because diversity matters. You just, for all kinds of reasons, you come up with better decisions if you have diversity on your team. And we had that same scenario. I was there, we had a mid-level lawyer, and then we had the junior lawyer in front of 2 clients, and the mid-level woman lawyer looked around and said, we need to go get drinks. I'm going to go get drinks. And then, no, stop. Just sit down right now. I'm going to go get the drinks. Please don't get the drinks. So anyway, Justice Peterson, question for you about gender dynamics. Is that something that you have confronted, whether you have or you haven't? What advice would you have for these incredible leaders here in this room about how to deal with negative gender dynamics?
So I think it's a hard one, right? Because it's kind of what I talked about before, where sometimes you think, wait, is this happening because is this an irrational gender dynamic, or is something else at play here? So you feel a little bit like deer in the headlights, a little like, what is this? Or maybe you don't even notice it and you think, yeah, it's normal for me to do this, right? So I think the first thing is to kind of be aware and to notice what's happening. So I think some of the areas as a lawyer where it can happen, and as a judge where it can happen, is like I discussed before, where people kind of constrain acceptable behavior for women into a more narrow box than for men. And I think that if that's happening, you just keep being yourself. I think that I'm always trying to get information though and feedback. I think stay curious. So maybe if you're getting some sort of feedback that you think that's just irrational, that's an irrational gender dynamic, I do try to drill down and think, okay, but what is the message here? So if people are saying you're being too nice, I want to think I do need to keep order in my courtroom. So I am going to watch for that. I'm going to do that in my way, but I don't want to have, I don't want to let it become a kindergarten class in my courtroom. So I do want to have control of my courtroom, and I'm not letting them define how I do that, but that is an important thing. So I don't just reject it out of hand. Sometimes I'm curious and think, okay, what's the message here? Is there something for me to learn? Separate out the wheat from the chaff, right? So one example, in the US Supreme Court, someone, I don't remember who did this, but they calculated who got interrupted the most, who interrupted each other the most. And there was something gendered about that the women, and we do this sometimes, we start a question, we have oral arguments where the lawyers come to us, make their arguments, and we ask questions. We often start our questions by saying, can I ask you a question? And I don't know if our male colleagues do that. We're kind of signaling to each other that we want to take a turn. So, but anyway, the study of the US Supreme Court found some gender dynamics at play in who did the interrupting and who was interrupted. And so it was before these two joined the court with me, it was me and 4 men, and everyone has a strong personality on the Supreme Court. There are no shrinking violets. And so I wanted to make sure that whatever question I had, I was going to ask it. So I think not letting it happen, right? And I didn't ever say anything about you're talking more than me or you cut me off. I just made sure that I was going to get my questions in. In a meeting, let's say you're in a meeting and somebody asks you to go get the drinks. What do you do? I think you have to judge the circumstance, but you could say, I need to hear the next part of this. Can we get somebody who's not part of the meeting to go get the drinks? Just like that, just don't do it. Just say, I actually need to be hearing this next part. Can we find someone who's not a participant in the meeting? And so maybe, I think you can decide at what level you want to call it out. And maybe it's just as it happens, and sometimes we have that whole like, darn it, I should have said this. But as you see it happening, or maybe even after you see it happening, just think, okay, what will I do next time? To either kind of call it out and say, no, I can't go get the drinks because we're about to talk about this and I want to hear that too. Or whatever comes to mind and feels like you. But I think it's something that can happen. It's often subconscious. it's often not because somebody wants to oppress you. It's because of conventions that people have gotten used to, that are subconscious. And so you know, in the moment, try to observe it and just think, how do I want to respond to this? What level does this take? And what's the best way to react? Do you have a question?
Yes, I was gonna ask if you had a method for if you're being interrupted, how you diffuse that. Do you have like a Mr. Vice President I'm speaking kind of method? What do you do?
You probably have examples of that.
Yeah. So I can think of a couple of things. So on our court, when we are asking questions, there are 5 of us, so there's just it's hard to know, like, we don't go in an order. So we're always trying to think about, like, did they finish their question? I don't want to step on their toes. And we're all really careful about that. Not everybody is. And so if I asked a question and before the person was finished answering, someone else would jump in and kind of derail the question. Sometimes I would just say, I would wait for them to finish saying what they were saying, and I'd say, but wait, I needed to hear the end of that. You know, just as simple as that. So I had to cross-examine, when I was in The Hague, I had to cross-examine a lot of members of the Serbian military. And it was really fun because when you're doing cross-examination, you have to decide, are these people, do they not know? Are they telling the truth? If they're not telling the truth, are they purposely lying, or do they just not know? Are they mistaken? And some of them were just lying. And so it's like the dream scenario where you get to cross-examine someone and try to catch them in their lies. But they did not like having this young woman asking them questions. These were like people who had been generals in the military 10 years before, and so they would interrupt a lot and they wouldn't answer the question. And I'd learned my cross-examination style by then. My style, I have a name for it. I developed it while traveling. I call it positive persistence. That is my style, because you know when you're traveling, like especially if you're flying and something goes wrong and then it just all goes wrong and you're missing your connection and everyone else is, and you can't get on the next flight. And there are all these people screaming at, you know, the poor person behind the counter. And this happened to me enough that I thought, I don't want to be lumped into the bucket of the person screaming behind the counter, because I think they get screamed at so much. If I do that, they're going to be like another screamer. So I am using positive persistence, which is, I really need to find a flight to get me there tomorrow. Is there anything you have? Gee, sorry, no, we don't. Okay, I really need to though. Are there other options? What can we do here? I'm not moving out of line. You see, I'm still here, but I'm being very positive and I'm making you my ally here. And so that was how I would cross-examine. And this was trial and error. I tried doing a tough, mean cross-examination like some of the other people I saw, and it was a total failure. My cross-examination would be, if they interrupted or whatever, or they would try to shoot questions back at me, and I would just say, in cross-examination, I'm the one asking you the questions, and I need you to tell me da-da-da. And they'd go off, no, I need to know this. Tell me this. And I would just hang in there. I'm not going anywhere. I'm still coming back and asking this question, but I'm doing it as me. I'm not losing control. I'm doing it as me. And so I deploy positive persistence in all of my interactions. And so I assume goodwill. I don't jump to a conclusion of bad will. Sometimes it may become apparent, and then you just have to decide how you want to react to that. But I stay in there, I'm curious, I'm thinking, I'm trying to think on my feet about how do I want to respond. But I almost kind of am viewing it in slow motion and keeping control of how I want to respond. So I try to, it's not, I have not mastered it. I'm always trying to perfect the positive persistence, but it's a good skill.
That's a great answer. Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
So one of the topics we didn't get to is difficult conversations, so I'm going to direct this to whoever wants to talk about it. And I want to go back to the gender dynamic scenario, because I think that's a good one for a difficult conversation. You've got somebody, you know, put yourself back into the law firm era, you've got a senior male partner and he's doing dumb stuff like I just described, but may not have ill will, is just like he's got serious implicit bias. I would like you to tell me, if you wouldn't mind, and this goes back to what you said about being curious, can you envision a scenario where you go in after you do it, you decide the best way to do this is not now, because I don't want to do it in front of the client and make it awkward, but I want to go in and I want to talk to this senior partner and just say, and I'm not going to tell you how I would do it, because I want to know and everyone else wants to know how you would do it. How do you have a conversation like that with the partner, or would you just not do that?
You know, I think this is a really tough one. I can think, the example that came right to mind when you talked about, or when you mentioned this, was a conversation I had with a colleague on the bench when I started. And we were in a discussion, and I wouldn't say it got heated, but we were both intently talking about our respective positions. And he said something that really was offensive to me about how I was approaching this case. And I remember it was like you're saying slow motion. It's almost like I felt myself in this moment. And I think my instinct was to just say nothing, move on. But I kind of knew in that moment if I did that, I would probably resent that, and that would probably build some distrust. And, you know, and I was going to be needing to work with this person for decades potentially, right? And have a good working relationship with them. And so I just stopped, at least in that moment, and I said, that really hurt my feelings. And I just said it that kind of just right there in the moment. And I said, that's not, you know, what I'm doing. That's not why I'm reaching this conclusion. And it was just a moment, and he felt, and I don't think in that moment he necessarily apologized, but he did later. It's like he had to kind of take that in, and he came to me and he said I was absolutely wrong, and I apologized. And it was just a moment where I think he said what he said, and I don't know that he really meant it. It just kind of came out. But rather than let that fester and let that kind of sour, and I think it would have. I really think if I had said nothing, I would have gone to my colleague down the hall and said, can you believe this happened? And it would have maybe changed everything about our relationship. But in that moment, I was able to just stand up for myself, but do it in a way that was non-confrontational. I mean, I was just direct, but I wasn't being mean. I wasn't yelling, but I also wasn't just taking it in and letting it fester. And I got over it, right? I mean, as soon as he apologized, it was done, right? And it was such, and to me, I thought, I'm so glad I handled it that way. And I'm not sure that if you'd asked me earlier in the day what you would have done if this happened, I would have had no idea. It just kind of came out that way, but it made a huge difference in our relationship. I also think about times at the law firm, and I will say I don't know that I ever went directly, well, that's not true. There were times I had to kind of sit someone down, but it's usually you've got a relationship with someone already. I think if you don't, then it's harder. But I think if you have a relationship with someone and they say or do something that is troubling or bothersome, and it might even be micro things, right? It may not be the biggest thing in the world, but it's that they're asking you to go get the drinks or whatever it is. I could go in those rooms and say, hey, I need to talk to you about something. I would do it in a way where I was making myself vulnerable, which is sometimes hard. But I felt like they could see I was sincere and genuine, and let's have a conversation. And I don't think those ever went badly, right? And I do think that people, I know from my perspective, if I was doing something that was bothering my colleagues or my clerks, I would want them to come tell me. And those are hard conversations to have, but it's so much better than letting that stuff just fester, because especially like in our dynamic or dynamics in different workplaces, if those things don't get addressed, I feel like everything kind of falls apart. And you really, if you lose trust with your colleagues, it's hard to do the job. It makes you not want to go to work, and usually you're just not as successful.
One thing. And sometimes people don't realize They want to be better, but they don't. One of the conversations I've had with a lot of my male colleagues is I feel strongly that one of the ways that, at least in the legal profession, that women still experience discrimination is men who don't want to work one-on-one with women, don't want to have them on a case where they have to travel alone, don't want to take them to lunch without other people there, that sort of thing. And when I've talked to men about this and explained how what that does is it really limits those women's opportunities. It limits their opportunities for mentorship and networking and client development and professional opportunities that they would otherwise have. Sometimes people are really surprised. They'll say, oh, I thought that was just a personal decision between, me and my spouse, that I wasn't going to go to lunch with one of my female colleagues alone. And when you explain how it has an actual real impact on women's careers, they're willing to change. And one of the things I would say sometimes is, well, could you imagine saying I'm not going to go to lunch with this person because of their religion or because of their race or something like that? And that's the same kind of decision that you're making. But I have found so many new allies in the workplace when you just sit down and actually explain how what they think of as a personal decision is actually negatively impacting women's careers. And so sometimes just having that direct conversation is the best way to approach it.
It's so well said. That education is so important. I know that issue's come up recently in town, and there's been some education around it, which is awesome. Bad news, our time's up. So how about one last hand for the majority of the Thank you so much. That was truly outstanding. Okay.